Space Marine 2 takes place nearly 200 years after the events of the original game, and both the universe and our titular character Titus have gone through their fair share of changes. We actually recapped the entire Space Marine 1 story in this video here if you wanted a recap of that game's plot. Whether you're going into Space Marine 2 fresh, you enjoyed the original, or even if you're a long-time 40k fan, I'm here to give you the absolutely essential lore and background that you need before going into Space Marine 2. The first piece of connective tissue between the two Space Marine titles is actually the 2023 shooter Warhammer 40,000 Boltgun. Boltgun takes place on Graia, the same planet from the original Space Marine, just several years after the events of the game. Playing as the Ultramarine Sternguard veteran Malum Cadia, you are sent to Graia by the Inquisition on a vital mission. The mission turns out to be the recovery of a fragment of the very same power source from Space Marine 1, the device that ultimately led to the then Captain Titus being held captive and disappearing for nearly a century, but not before he shattered the artifact into fragments.
I will finish the work Captain Titus started!
In Boltgun, the remains of the power source is stolen by the Chaos Sorcerer Samael, who used it to open up a warp rift that threatened to engulf not only the planet, but the entire sector. Eventually, after Malum Cadia defeats the Sorcerer, Inquisitor Sable arrives to retrieve the power source for the Inquisition, and in doing so seals the warp rift and scurries the device away. Now, time is a weird thing in Warhammer 40,000. The current 40k timeline is currently in a period known as the Era Indomitus, sometime within the 42nd millennium during the 4th Tyrannic War, which the now newly demoted Lieutenant Titus has been thrust into. There have been some enormous events that have come to pass in the 40k universe since the release of the original game, many of which have shaped the background and story of Space Marine 2, so let's go through some of the biggest. First, the fall of Cadia. Cadia was the Imperium's most important fortress world, serving as a bastion against Chaos forces emerging from the Eye of Terror. Basically, the Eye of Terror is a big rift in reality that all the Chaos Space Marines and demons want to pour out of, and Cadia is what stood in the way. In the year 999 of the 41st millennium, Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, launched a military campaign upon the galaxy, dubbed the 13th Black Crusade. This would become his most successful assault on the galaxy. Despite a huge number of forces on both the Chaos and Imperium side, Abaddon would emerge victorious through a desperate act which saw him launching an enormous star fort called a Blackstone Fortress into the planet. The massive kinetic force of such an impact caused the planet to be ripped apart and swallowed by the warp. Cadia is one of the most important planets in the 40k canon, and is important to Space Marine 2 as the Cadians will be making up most, if not all, of the human allies fighting against the Tyranid hordes in Space Marine 2. Despite their planet being reduced to chunks, Cadian forces can still be found across the galaxy, as the Cadian system produced huge numbers of troops before it fell. One of the smaller details that marks the in-game troopers as Cadian natives are their purple eyes. We first saw this detail back when Space Marine 2 was announced, as a member of the Astra Militarum looked upon their Astartes saviors with awe and reverence. Now let's talk about the return of the Ultramarines Primarch Robute Guilliman. For those of you who don't know, Primarchs are the genetically engineered sons of the Emperor of Mankind, which he bred to be his perfect, immortal, superhuman generals and leaders, second only to the Emperor himself. In the late 30th millennium, the Emperor of Mankind crafted 20 of these Primarchs and used their genetic template to craft 20 Space Marine legions. Roboute Guilliman is the Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines. During the 30th millennium, the Horus Heresy tore the Imperium apart, throwing loyalists, traitor legions, and their Primarchs into a civil war. Roboute Guilliman and his Ultramarines, of course, sided with the loyalists, but Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons turned traitor. These are the Chaos enemies that we'll be facing in the Space Marine 2 campaign. More on them later. During the aftermath of this, Guilliman was wounded by the traitor Primarch Fulgrim, his wounds being so severe that he was put into stasis, remaining in his wounded slumber for over 10,000 years, until he was finally resurrected after the fall of Cadia. Roboute Guilliman returned, not only as the Primarch of the Ultramarines, the chapter which Lieutenant Titus serves, but now also leads the Imperium as a whole as the current Lord Commander and Imperial Regent. Space Marines have such an incredible reverence towards their Primarch, with many of them seeing them as not only their demigod leader, but also their father. So the possibility that we may see Astartes refer to Robute Guilliman, or maybe even see him appear in the game, could lead to some extremely interesting developments. But let's stick to the need-to-knows for now. As you may expect from the grimdark far future, it's pretty easy for things to go from bad to worse. After the events of Cadia's fall and Robute's revival, a gargantuan galaxy-spanning warp rift appeared, and essentially tore the galaxy in two, separating the halves with warp storms and tears in reality. This rift has also allowed further chaos incursions into the galaxy, stretching the Imperial forces rather thin. We will come back to why this is important later, but for now let's shift our focus into the main boy in blue himself, Lieutenant Titus. Demetrian Titus is our returning Ultramarine protagonist, but where has he been in the years since the original Space Marine, and what's with his new outfit? I won't be recapping the story of the first Space Marine here. Again, you can check out this video if you want a refresher, but the finale of Space Marine saw Captain Titus getting reported to the Inquisition by the Ultramarine Leandros, and then arrested by Inquisitor Jerome Thrax under suspicion of potential heresy, as Titus had shown a resistance to the warp throughout the events of the game. But as we said earlier, that was nearly 200 years ago, so where has he been and what has he been up to? For a bit more context, we're going to look at issue 498 of the Warhammer magazine White Dwarf, which featured some more background lore for Captain Titus. Unfortunately for Titus, after the events on Graia, Inquisitor Thrax kept him in stasis for decades, only awakening him to run brutal tests and interrogations in a vain attempt to uncover some hidden corruption within the Space Marine. Ironically, Thrax would later fall to chaos and corruption himself, and would be slain by the Grey Knights after being possessed by a demon. This led to the Inquisition seizing Thrax's holdings and discovering Titus and many other captive Space Marines imprisoned in stasis. The Inquisitor who discovered these Astartes sent them to the Death Watch Fortress, Watcher Keep, for evaluation, where Titus would finally be deemed free of heresy. However, after being cut off from the Ultramarines for so long, Titus felt as though he had no chapter to return to, and believed that his story brought shame to the Ultramarines. So, he would instead join the Death Watch as a Black Shield. The Death Watch are a unique chapter that works closely with the Inquisition and specializes in anti-Xenos warfare. They are some of the Imperium's most elite alien killers. Their numbers are also made up of Space Marines from other chapters who have joined the Death Watch to serve for a period of time, a great honor for most Astartes. This is visually represented by the armor of the Space Marine being painted black, but their right pauldron retaining the colors of their original chapter. Another mark of the Death Watch is the shoulder plate and entire left arm is electroplated silver and polished to a high shine, with the shoulder plate bearing markings of the Inquisition. A Death Watch Black Shield, however, is an Astartes that has been severed from their own chapter, either through their own choice, exile, or potentially darker reasons. Titus's decision to become a Black Shield was basically a form of self-exile, as he took the black, so to speak, and in doing so he adopted the new name Nullus. Titus, or Nullus, served in the Death Watch for many years, content that he could continue to serve humanity by waging war against the galaxy's many Xenos threats. We are so far out of the realms of the original game's plot now, so if you don't want to hear any more about how Titus may reappear in Space Marine 2, or my theory crafting on the subject, this is your warning, click away now or jump to this timestamp. During the Fourth Tyrannic War, Titus would find themselves reinforcing Kadaku, one of the planets that appears in Space Marine 2 from the Tyranid hordes. However, the craft carrying their kill team would come under attack from flying Tyranids, and Nullus would be left gravely wounded after battling a massive Carnifex. An event that this scene from the Space Marine 2 promotional material seems to be hinting at. An Ultramarines force led by the chapter's chief librarian Varro Tigerius sensed Titus's soul, and as they had not known what fate became of Titus after the events of Graia, they deployed to recover him. However, Titus's wounds were so severe that his only chance to survive was to cross the Rubicon and become a Primaris Marine. What's one of those? Well, I'll explain shortly. But this event would see Titus brought back into the fold of the Ultramarines, although, since he's been gone for so long, his previous role as captain is now filled by Sevastus Acheran, so Titus would humbly accept a demotion to lieutenant, but would reclaim his name and his chapter. While it is not yet certain, I believe it is from these moments that the story of Space Marine 2 will kick off. Going back to the whole Primaris thing, if you played the original Space Marine but haven't kept up with the comings and goings of Warhammer 40,000, you may be out of the loop when it comes to this new flavour of Space Marine. Basically, a Primaris Marine is similar to the Marines you may have seen Titus fighting alongside back in 2011, but the next step in Astartes' evolution. Bigger, stronger, and the new standard for Space Marines. Over 10 millennia prior to the current timeline, Robute Guilliman tasked Belisarius Cole, an Archmagus of the Mechanicum, with creating the next generation of warriors. Tens of thousands of Primaris Marines were created by Cole, and this new generation of space crusading super soldiers continued to be cultivated by the majority of Space Marine chapters. The non-Primaris Marines, what Titus was in the original game, are now called Firstborn, but there is a process that allows a Firstborn Marine to be transformed into a Primaris Marine called the Rubicon Primaris. It is also known as the Calgarisian Rites in honour of the Ultramarines chapter master Marnius Calgar, who underwent the operation himself. But it is this procedure that is responsible for Lieutenant Titus's new form and stature. The eagle-eyed among you may have also noticed a lot of the weapons have also changed in the years between games. New Marines need a new kit, so Primaris also have their own equipment and weapons, more suited to this new generation of Astartes, weapons which will make up the majority of the usable war gear in Space Marine 2. For example, instead of the standard Boltgun from previous 40k games, the standard issue bolt weapon of the Primaris is the larger bolt rifle. There is also a new standard version of Space Marine power armor, the Mark 10 Tacticus armor, which you can see Titus and the rest of the Ultramarines wearing throughout the trailers. There are also some other armor variants like the heavily armored Gravis pattern or the lightweight Phobos pattern. But all of that is to say, there are going to be a lot of new guns, gadgets, and suits of armor to hunt Xenos and Heretics with in Space Marine 2. Now we get to the filthy Xenos and Heretic enemies of Space Marine 2, the Tyranids and the Thousand Suns. The Tyranids, also known as the Great Devourer, is a giant spacefaring, insectoid-like alien race driven by a hive mind, whose sole purpose is to consume all organic material across the galaxy, and boy, do they look hungry. From their ships to their weaponry, they are entirely biological, and all linked together into the larger hive mind, or as part of a hive fleet. The Hive Fleet we'll be getting up close and personal with in Space Marine 2 is Hive Fleet Leviathan, the strain of Xenos responsible for the 4th Tyrannic War we mentioned earlier, and a foe Titus now has much more experience fighting from his stint in the Death Watch. Tyranids also come in all shapes and sizes, such as the smaller Hormagaunts and Termagaunts who make up the dense waves of the creatures, as well as the larger forms like warriors. These larger forms are also synaptic creatures, which means they are able to direct smaller Tyranids, while also acting as a link to the larger hive mind, and killing one of these creatures can disrupt that link. On the side of Chaos this time round, however, are the forces of the Thousand Suns. The Thousand Suns were one of the original Space Marine legions, but turned traitor during the Horus Heresy, with the legion and their Primarch Magnus the Red eventually dedicating themselves to the Chaos God of Change and Sorcery, Tzeentch. One of the main features of the Thousand Suns is their use of warp magic, with most members of the Legion having sorceress abilities and their war gear being touched by the warp. The other main feature is that long ago, the vast majority of the Thousand Suns Marines were turned to dust and entombed within their warp-infused armor. This was due to a spell cast by the Thousand Suns Chief Librarian Azek Araman. The intention was to rid the Thousand Suns of mutation, but instead, the less psychically sensitive Marines were cursed and became the Mindless Rubricae, meaning there will be plenty of spell slinging and demon summoning when we come to face off against the other Boys in Blue. This not only makes them a unique enemy, but could lead to some interesting moments across Space Marine 2, since as we discussed earlier, our main protagonist Titus has some uncanny resistance to the ruinous powers. But how exactly these elements will clash, we'll just have to wait and see. And with that, I think I've covered all of the essential lore for anyone returning to Warhammer 40,000 after playing the original, or for folks new to the franchise. We're going to have plenty of Warhammer content in the lead up to Space Marine 2, as well as more to come after the game launches. So subscribe so you don't miss that, like the video if you enjoyed, and thank you for watching.